For decades, the wealthiest Americans have maintained sharp, clear minds well into their 70s and 80s, while millions of their peers struggle with mental fog, fatigue, and fading recall. The gap is not genetics. It is not luck. If the connection between elite mental performance and largely forgotten nutritional science interests you, consider subscribing so you never miss a video like this. Since 1933, a small circle of physicians, industrialists, and financiers quietly adopted a protocol built around one overlooked mineral, one specific dietary pattern, and a handful of practices that modern neuroscience has since validated. They called it, informally, the third eye regimen, a nod to the pineal gland sitting at the center of the brain, long associated with clarity, circadian rhythm, and hormonal regulation. What they understood then, and what most Americans still do not know now, is the subject of this video. The story begins not in a laboratory, but in a boardroom. In the spring of 1933, as the Great Depression tightened its grip on ordinary Americans, a small group of industrialists gathered in New York City at the behest of a physician named Royal Lee. Lee was not famous. He was not celebrated in mainstream medicine, but he had spent years studying the relationship between processed food, mineral depletion, and cognitive decline. And what he told that room of powerful men changed the way they fed their own brains for the rest of their lives. Lee's central argument was startling in its simplicity. The industrial food system, he said, was stripping the American diet of the fat, soluble vitamins and trace minerals that the brain's pineal gland required to function. Specifically, he pointed to iodine, magnesium, and a fat-soluble compound he called Activator X, later identified by researchers as vitamin K2. Without these, he argued, the pineal gland calcified prematurely. Mental fog followed. So did fatigue, poor sleep, and declining memory. The men in that room listened. They were not idealists. They were pragmatists who ran railroads, newspapers, and chemical companies. They wanted to stay sharp. And so they adopted Lee's recommendations quietly, without press releases, without public announcements. They sourced grass-fed dairy. They ate organ meats weekly. They supplemented with kelp for iodine and took magnesium in the form of magnesium chloride dissolved in water each morning. They avoided refined flour and refined sugar with the discipline of athletes. What is remarkable is how well documented this actually is, not in newspaper headlines, but in the private correspondence and dietary records that survived in the archives of the Lee Foundation for Nutritional Research, established in Milwaukee in 1941. Those records show a consistent picture. The men who followed the protocol reported fewer headaches, faster thinking, and better sleep within weeks. Several noted in letters that they felt, as one railroad executive wrote, 20 years younger in the head. The pineal gland itself deserves a moment of explanation. Roughly the size of a grain of rice, it sits deep in the center of the brain and produces melatonin, the hormone that governs sleep cycles. It is also one of the first structures in the brain to calcify with age, a process accelerated, researchers now believe, by fluoride exposure, chronic magnesium deficiency, and a diet high in refined carbohydrates. By midlife, a significant portion of Americans show visible calcification of the pineal gland on brain scans. The elite knew this decades before the public did. Modern neuroscience has since confirmed several of Lee's foundational claims. Magnesium threonate, a form of magnesium developed by researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has been shown in clinical studies to cross the blood-brain barrier more effectively than older forms, improving synaptic density and working memory. A landmark study published in the journal Neuron in 2016 found that aged mice given magnesium threonate showed synaptic density improvements equivalent to reversing roughly a decade of neurological aging. Human trials conducted at MIT and later replicated by teams in Beijing showed statistically significant gains in working memory scores after just 6 weeks of supplementation at doses between 1 and 2 grams daily. Iodine deficiency, even mild deficiency, is now linked to measurable reductions in cognitive performance. Vitamin K2, found in grass-fed butter and fermented foods, plays a documented role in preventing soft tissue calcification, including in the brain. None of this is fringe science. It is published, peer-reviewed, and increasingly acknowledged in mainstream medicine. What remains quietly extraordinary is that a circle of wealthy Americans figured most of it out in 1933, guided by a largely marginalized nutritionist whom the American Medical Association spent years trying to discredit. The discrediting campaign against Royal Lee is itself a telling chapter in this story. Through the 1950s and 60s, the Food and Drug Administration pursued Lee relentlessly, ultimately convicting him on charges related to misbranded products in 1962. His writings were ordered destroyed. Tons of his published literature were seized and pulped. The institutional effort to silence him was, by any measure, extraordinary in its intensity, which has led many historians of nutritional medicine to argue that the campaign was less about consumer protection and more about protecting the processed food industry. Consider the scale of what was at stake. By 1960, the processed food industry represented roughly $90 billion in annual revenue. Companies including General Mills, Continental Baking, and the nascent fast food chains had built their entire business models on the refined flour and refined sugar that Lee had spent 3 decades condemning. A mainstream endorsement of his findings would have amounted to a structural indictment of the industry's core products. The FDA action against Lee cost him his publishing operation and effectively ended his public influence, but it arrived 30 years too late to reach the men who had already changed how they ate. The men who had already internalized his teachings were not affected. They had no labels to seize. They had only habits formed quietly 30 years earlier that continued to serve them well into old age. What can someone over 50 do with this today? The answer is more accessible than you might expect. Iodine-rich foods, including seaweed, wild-caught fish, and pastured eggs, are widely available. Magnesium glycinate and magnesium threonate are sold without prescription in every health food store in America. Grass-fed butter and hard-aged cheeses are reliable sources of vitamin K2. Gouda, aged longer than 6 months, contains some of the highest concentrations of K2 measured in any food source, with roughly 75 micrograms per 100 grams, a quantity achievable with 2 modest servings per week. Eliminating refined flour and refined sugar from the diet removes the single largest driver of neuroinflammation and blood sugar volatility, both of which directly impair cognitive performance. Sleep, too, is part of the equation. The pineal gland produces melatonin in darkness. Artificial light after sunset particularly blue light from screens, suppresses that production with measurable effect. Research from Harvard Medical School, published in 2014, found that exposure to blue wavelength light in the 2 hours before sleep reduced melatonin output by as much as 50% and pushed the body's internal clock forward by nearly 3 hours, compressing the deep sleep phases most critical to memory consolidation. The elite families who adopted Lee's protocol in the 1930s did not have smartphones. They went to bed early, in dark rooms, and woke with the light. That simple discipline, ancient by human standards, is one of the most powerful things any person can do for long-term brain health. The third eye secret, stripped of its mystique, is this. The brain needs specific raw materials that the modern American diet systematically withholds. The people who knew that in 1933 acted on it. Their descendants, in many cases, still do. The rest of the country is only now catching up, guided by the same science that one Milwaukee nutritionist tried to share with the world nearly a century ago.